Okay, in this tutorial, we are going to look at how to use a different means of controlling player motion. We're also going to be looking at how to generate sort of an infinitely tiled road that just goes in a straight line, which, just to kind of show the basics of some ways we can use colliders. We're not making this more challenging by putting in turns or changing the direction of motion or anything. And you'll see that unlike when we use a rigid body and add force to control our motion, the player stays put when I stop doing input. And so, this is a means of gameplay that is sometimes useful. And so, and you'll also see the other thing we're doing is we're going to be having a bolt script that's going to randomly generate obstacles to our path. Right now they're just colliders, and there's a lot more we could do with this. You can see that it does, I can hit them. And you'll also notice that as I turn, the object rotates side to side. And so we'll kind of look at a way to map one range of values, which is the motion along the x-axis, into rotation along the z. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new scene. So I'm going to go ahead and say File, New Scene. And the only things I want to put in here so far are just a plane. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a plane. I'm going to leave it at the normal scale, and you'll notice, it came in at a slightly strange position. All we're going to do is we're going to go up to the three little dots here on the transform and reset the whole thing, so it's in the right place to begin with. And then we also need to create a cube, which is just going to be our stand-in for our player. Now, once we've done this, we can actually use this as our stand-in, and then we can apply all the things we do here to another object. Once we have some asset created that is more attractive than a cube. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and hit in the transform, I'm going to hit reset so it centers it here. And then I can go ahead and just move my view so this is a little bit more centered here. The cube is halfway through the plane right now, which I don't want. So I'm going to go ahead and in the Y position, I'm going to set that to 0.5, which should bring it up so it's just barely above the surface of the plane. Okay, so we've got that done, right? And so what we need to do now is the first thing we're going to work on is, and you'll see these are all the assets from all the tutorials we've worked on. We'll look at these road tiles and things here in a little bit, but what we need to do is we need to be able to move this character. And previously we did that by adding a rigid body and then applying motion to that rigid body by using add force or adjusting the velocity of the rigid body. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to use a different component called a character controller. So if I click on add component and I type in CHAR, the very first option that comes up is character controller. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Now, once I've done that, some things to note is that you'll see inside this cube, I've got this these green lines here. What that means is, that's my box collider, And inside the cube, I also have this, it looks like a sphere collider, And that sphere collider is the character controller. If I turn this off, for some reason it's still visible, but it is the collider. If I go here to radius and I adjust the radius to say 1, you can see that it grows significantly larger. Now, I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 0.5 for the time being. But the one thing I'm definitely going to do is I'm going to get rid of the box collider. Now, you may think that this could be problematic, but the reason that character colliders have round or sometimes capsule-shaped colliders is because if you have a box collider like this and you're moving along a surface, the edges of that box will catch and you get really jittery motion. Whereas if you have, and you can imagine that, like if you've ever tried to slide something, you know, square and hard across a surface, everything catches. Whereas if it's a little rounded on the bottom, so there's less points of contact, it goes a lot smoother. And when you transition from, which is why wheels work, you know, along with the whole rolling part. But, you know, when you transition from, you know, one surface, like say up a ramp or something like that, it also smooths it out, right? And so this is how most games do things, and most interaction works, is with a rounded surface, right? Rather than an actual surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click on the box collider, and I'm just going to say remove component, because this character controller should have all the collision stuff built in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the radius of this. I'm just going to change it to 0.6. And the reason for that is just to make it a little bit outside the bounds of this, right? One of the issues with this is objects will be able to essentially intersect to wherever this character until it hits the character collider, right? So there's going to be corners where, you know, you could have an obstacle that kind of cuts into your player, but that's not, you know, the biggest issue in the world. It's just something to be conscious of. Okay, so I've adjusted the radius a tiny bit, right? So it just sticks out of the surfaces a little bit. There's all these other things here. So there's slope limit, step offset, skin width, minimum move distance, etc. So slope limit means that this character, when we're applying motion to this character, the maximum angle it can climb is, you know, what would be like 44.9 degrees or something like that, right? If it's a surface is steeper than that, it won't go up. The step offset means basically how big of a step can it climb. So if you had a stepped staircase or several objects, it basically says, can it just roll up a little step? Or is, you know, how tall is something going to be that stops it from going up without a jump? The skin width is an additional setting that helps with if there's like intersection problems between your character and a wall or something like that. Skin width helps to kind of beef that out a little bit. And then minimum move distance is what it says. It allows you to set, like, either not move very much, or anytime you move, you have to move like 1 unit or something like that, right? It allows you to have a bit more freedom in terms of setting that minimum. And it makes life a little easier. And then the center, right? Basically, where should this character controller be centered on your object? And sometimes you want your character controller not in the center of your object. Like say you had like a 20-foot tall, I don't know. I've been reading my kids The Chronicles of Narnia, so I think about giants a lot. So, right, maybe you have like a character that's a giant, and if you had this round character controller right in the middle of your character, you wouldn't have any ground intersections, right? So you might want to actually bring this down to the surface so you can deal with ground. Because that's one of the other things that the character controller allows you to do, is it has an is grounded option, which basically it says, is this collider colliding with something that we've labeled as ground? And that allows us to do things like jump, but then not do a double jump, right? So you can jump, but if you're up in the air, you can't jump again, right? And it allows you to have a lot more control over certain settings. So right now, that's all you need to know about the character controller for the time being. So what we need to do is we need to be able to move. We want to be able to use input to move this character, right? And we're going to use W, A, S, and D again. Those are the standard inputs. The other thing I'm going to show you as well is I do have a gamepad here. It's just the Logitech like 310 or something like that. I don't know. F310. And so it's just a wired, like your standard, 4-button, 1 direction pad, 2 thumb axes that you can work with, and then some trigger buttons for your left and right, fingers. So it's just like, your standard, modern controller. And so we'll talk about how to interface those as well. a little bit. Even though I'm not going to show you, I'll just show you the outputs of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and start scripting this so we can actually control our character. So to do that with the character controller, we're gonna need to add a graph. So we're going to say bolt flow machine, and let's go ahead and make this a macro, and I'm probably going to have to figure out what to name it. So I'm going to click new. I know I've got, you know, a ton of different things named character. I'm just going to call this Bob move, because this box is going to be called Bob. So you should probably call it player movement or something that makes more sense, but I just want to make sure that I'm absolutely not going to have to do this a second time when it tells me that I have made a mistake. So I'm going to say Bob move for me, save it, and then I'm going to go ahead and edit this graph. And so the thing that I need, right, I don't need the update or start events right now. What I need is input. And really, actually, I guess I do need the update event, right? Now, we've made other have other graphs that have the next few steps in them. And so what I did previously is I just copied the relevant units over and pasted them in here to save myself some time. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and add these units back. So real quick, we are going to need our input, right? So we need input. Oops. We need input. Geez, I can't not type. Input. And what we want is the get axis, right? Input.getAxis. And we're going to need 2 of those. So I'm going to, and actually we could probably just use 1 to start with, but let's go ahead and copy and paste. All right, so we have our 2 axes. So for this motion, some of the stuff that we're doing is things that we've done before. And in particular, we created a super unit that allowed us to take the axis, whatever axis we wanted, and generate force from that, right? We were able to translate that input into force. And so rather than redo that work, let's reuse that work. So to reuse it, what we need to do is we need to figure out, you know, which graph had that section in it. And so if we go to one of our previous scenes, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my scenes folder, and this XZ motion tutorial is the one that I did that work in. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to save this. Oh yes, I should save my scene. I'm going to call this Bob moves is what I'm going to call this scene. You should call it either, you know, non-physics based motion or character controller motion would be a really great thing to name this. Okay, so I come back to this scene, and if I select my player and I come down here to edit graph, right, I've got this player movement graph, and you can see I've got these super units. Now, what I'd like you to do is you should have these super units in yours as well. And what I would like you to do is to select one of these super units and then come over here in your graph inspector and check in and see what it is. If it says it's an embed, right, instead of a macro, what I want you to do is select it and hit convert. And then it will ask you to save a macro, right? And so I just named it, right, convert axis input to force was what I called this super unit. All right, if we click on edit graph, just as a reminder, right, this graph, we have our input, which has flow, it has the name of the axis, and it has the speed that we want to move at. And then it grabs that axis input, and it does a few things here, right? It takes the speed and it multiplies it by the value that came out of the axis, which in this case is a range of values from -1 to 1. And then on top of that, it took the change in time from the last frame and it multiplied that to this, which then gives us a manageable amount of force to add to our unit. Now, in this case, it's not really, we then sent this out to add force. In our case, we're going to put this into a different a different function that's part of the character controller. Right? And so, so this is the super unit. So if you're coming from a different, if you haven't watched the previous tutorials, you might take a moment to make this super unit. Okay, so let's go ahead, and if we just click on player here, we can get back to our original graph. And right, this is a macro. Now, the reason we want to save this as a macro is so we can reuse it, and we can reuse these super units. And so what I can do is, if I go back to my other scene now, if I go to project and go to scenes again and go to, oh, dang it, I saved it in the main assets folder. Let me go ahead and drag this into the scenes folder just for sanity. And so here's Bob Move, so I'm going to come back here. And now if I go ahead and I select my cube, right, which maybe we should just rename this Bob or player or whatever you want to call it. But I'm going to go ahead and rename it right now so it's at least a little bit special. I'm going to select it in the hierarchy again. I'm going to go down to flow graph. And now when I right click in here and say add unit, if I type convert, the very first option that comes up here is convert axis to force, right? So this is one of my super units, and note that it's in nesting. So I'm going to go ahead and create this, and then I'm going to go back and add unit again. And rather than adding a unit, I just want to show you, if I click on nesting, and you'll notice that if I'm just using it, it doesn't show me all the super units that I have down here. I actually have to search for them. I have to know the names of the super units that I created in order to use them. That's just something to note. But so I've got my super unit. So we need an axis name, so we're going to need a variable that allows us to get that axis name. I'm going to go ahead and just create a graph variable. So I'm going to be up here, and because it's something we don't need to know too much, but I'm just going to say the motion I'm interested in with this first one is the x-axis motion. That's the primary one. We're going to do the y-axis as well, but for now we're just going to do the x-axis. So I'm just going to call this little x and then axis, and I'm going to go ahead and hit plus, and I'm going to make this type a string, and then I'm going to type in capital H horizontal as the name. Now that I've done that, I'm just going to click on this, and maybe if it decides that it likes me, I will come down here, or if for some reason this graph variable is being feisty and I don't know why there it goes. It finally allowed me to grab it. It seems like it's really fussy about where you grab from, which is kind of annoying, but that's all right. So I'm going to go ahead and run this in here. I'm also going to need a variable that's a speed variable. But what I want to do is I want that speed variable to be something that's accessible from the inspector for my object. And that's the difference between like a graph variable and an object variable. Graph variables are things that like only the graph needs them, but you don't necessarily need to access them, right? Like I don't need to change this. It's going to be rare that I'm going to need to change the name of the x-axis, but I might want to be able to increase or decrease the speed pretty easily. So I can either create an object variable over here by clicking on the Objects tab and putting in the variable name and creating it, or I can come over to the variables on my object and add one. And of course, I always do this where I hit plus first. So I'm going to go ahead and call this speed, and it's just going to be like a lowercase speed. I'm going to hit plus. I'm going to make this a float. And let's start out at a speed of 10. We can obviously always change that. And now that I've done that, if I pull this variable in here, if I click it like 8 times, there we go. I finally got my speed. I can pull the speed in, connect it in here, and then what I need to do is the flow for this graph, needs to come through the update function. And really we're going to look at this and then we'll probably make a change. And we'll talk about what's going on and why in a little bit. So this is all coming in. Now we have this force that's going to come out, and we have our flow that comes out. And so what we need to do is we need to be able to move our character. And so if I add a unit and I just type in move, there's all of these options. Where is it? Nope. Okay. That's a little bit too. So we just need to type in character controller, and you have to spell character correctly or else it doesn't like you at all. So character controller, and the third option down here is move, and it says move and motion. And there's actually two different types of character controller moves, so I'm actually going to try and actually retype this correctly. So it's character controller dot move, and you'll see that, oops, sorry, I keep making typos. Here we go. So we've got motion and we've got speed. It says motion is a more complex move function taking absolute movement deltas. What I've always done previously is the not simple move, but the normal move. So let's go ahead and use the normal character control move. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sneak this in here. And this force, right, I can't connect it straight away. And actually, I probably just need to undo the connection there, because what I need to do is I need to put this into a vector 3 so that it is applied correctly. So I'm just going to go add unit and just type in new vector, and that gives me new vector 3, and I want the new vector 3 x, y, z. And I want this to be going into the x dimension. Right now, we don't need to worry about y or z moving. We're just going to try and make sure that we get this to work. So I've connected the last of those connections there, and we've got our basics down. So let's go ahead and see if we can move this character back and forth horizontally. So I'm hitting play, and I'm waiting. Okay, so one thing you'll note, right, it hopped up a little bit, and that's because I have my collision detection sphere set so that it's a little bit up. And you'll see that this is actually moving pretty smoothly. Now, it may get to a point where it gets a little laggy, and we'll see if there's a better way to fix that. But right now, we're happy, right? We've got motion in the we've got motion in the x-axis. Okay, so let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is, rather than use motion in the z direction, right, forward motion, right, because what's going to happen is, what we're doing is we're going to have this character basically stay still, but the road is going to be changing speed, right? So if we're going faster, the road tiles go by more quickly. But it's the character stays put in one place in the world and just goes back and forth. So we're going to use the W and the S for vertical motion, for along the y-axis. So we're going to go ahead and stop this. And then let's go ahead and duplicate this a bit. Now I'm reusing the speed variable because it makes sense that the motion would be the same in all directions for what we're doing. So the other things we'll have to do is we're going to need to create one more new graph variable, and then we'll do a couple more steps. So let's go ahead and create a copy of this super unit. So I'm selecting it. I'm going to Command or Control C, Command or Control V to paste. I know the speed's going to stay the same, so I'm going to leave that in there. One thing we need to do is we'll need to reroute some of this flow. And it doesn't really matter which one of these we hit first. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the exit here. I'm going to take the exit to the flow and then the exit to the flow. I know that the force coming out of here, I'm going to want to go to the Y direction. So I'm going to go to Y. And then now I just need to add that new variable for the axis name. So I'm going to come up to my graph variables here. I'm going to say lowercase y, capital A, AXIS. I'm going to hit plus, and then I'm going to create a string, and the value for that will be vertical with a capital V. And once that's done, I'm going to click in my graph again. I'm going to click right between these two things. I'm going to select it once, select it twice. There we go. And now I can just drop this into my axis. And if we hit play, we should now be able to control our character horizontally and vertically. So let's see here. Oh, but I've made a mistake. Something isn't working right. Now what in the heck is going on here, right? I'm getting motion, but it's all the same motion, right? It's like if I press Y and S, or W and S, sorry. If I press W and S, I'm moving in the X and the Y direction at the same time. If I press A and D, I'm not getting any motion whatsoever right now. So what's going on? This took me a long time to figure out. I'm going to go ahead and stop this. So what's happening, and I guess I should talk about how I figured this out, because I'm new to this as well. And so I'm trying to figure out, why is this super unit ignoring one of the axes? So if I hit play again, the way that I figured it out was by looking at the values that were coming through this system and then just trying things, right? So you can see that, okay, I have my horizontal axis, I have my vertical axis. Right now, speed is 10 coming in both directions. And maybe if I zoom, I can't zoom in any more than that. Okay, maybe I can zoom in my screen just a touch. I don't know why. There we go. Okay. So I have my vertical and horizontal, and you see right now these are zeros. If I press W on the keyboard, you'll see that both of these values, where one should not be moving at all, are moving at the same rate. They're identical. So it's as though these are not being done. And you'll note that it's oddly, whatever the second option is here, is the one that the keys are controlling both. Now, I honestly don't know quite why that's happening, but I do know that even though these are different axes that I'm asking for, the only one that's being used is the vertical. So what I found was the problem is that these were macros. And with the macros, what happens with a macro is that even though I'm able to reuse these here, it's being really problematic with reusing these variables again. So we need to pause this and make a change. Okay, so we need to make a change here. And the change that I found that worked in my case was to convert these from macros to embeds. And so if I select this super unit and I click convert, now it is an embed. If I select this one and click convert, now that's an embed as well. Now I don't know why this change is necessary, but I'm assuming that a macro, for some reason, the variable isn't updating, and maybe I need to create scene variables, or maybe there's some other option in order to make that function better. But in this case, making those embeds works, right? So now I have isolated x-axis motion and isolated y-axis motion, right? And I don't know if it's a bug, if I just am new to this and haven't learned the intricacies of the two different types of graphs, but now I can move this object in X and Y. Okay, so this is the first part of this tutorial, is to create this XY motion for our player. So we're going to pause for a second and come back with the next section where we will create our tile, not necessarily generator, but basically we'll create an empty object that holds the different game tiles and allows them to cycle through.